Welcome to video 2 of our Integration Best Practices training. Again, I'm David Gatley, the Senior Certification Engineer for the Certified Integration team, and with me I have John Anderson, the Solution Architect for the Pre-Sales team. In this video, we're going to be covering several of the best practices that relate to a data import into ServiceNow. We're going to provide you an introduction to import sets. We'll briefly describe the differences between web service imports and really show you the details of a data source import. Make sure to catch video 3 of this series, in which we'll go into greater detail for a web service integration. Additionally, we'll be creating a data source and showing you many of the considerations, best practices, and benefits around managing data source integration. And to cap this off, we're going to be showing you a scheduled data import. Just at a high level, to get you introduced to the concept of an import set table, we provide you with a temporary staging area to bring data into ServiceNow, which then provides multiple layers of added functionality, from mapping to transforming that data to your destination table. These really give the customer far greater control over data coming into their instance and provide a much more elegant solution for bringing data into and managing that data within ServiceNow. So, like every other table within ServiceNow, an import set table also has web service APIs extended to it. Additionally, we can use a data source to bring data into this import set table. In this video, we'll be outlining exactly how to define and configure that data source, as well as the various pieces that go along with it, like a mid server. John will be walking you through the various steps around creating this data source and configuring it for your import set table and your target table.
In this scenario, we're going to assume that we have an application within ServiceNow that handles our research items on a particular topic. So we can go in here and we would have a list of research items based off of website URLs, text from that URL, as well as any discussion comments that our team has on that research item. Research items can go through different states. They have a life cycle of new, in progress, or done. And they can be assigned to different users for completion or other assignments with this research item. In the scenario, we're going to integrate with a third-party research company. That research company will do some research on our behalf and push that research to us. Also, they have a staff doing the research, and they want to move their user records into our user table as well. And we want to be able to tell the difference between our system users as well as their users in their system that they've pushed over to us. So in this integration example, we're going to create a data source that makes a JDBC database call to their database, which houses a MySQL database with a user table. We're going to pull those users into our user table and associate them with a correlation ID and display value so that we can tell that they're from this third-party source. That way, when we get research items that may be handled by that third party, we'll see who is assigned to that specific research item in that company. So to do this, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to modify the user table. Let's first make sure that our update set is selected, which it is, because we want to be able to capture these changes. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our user table and add a couple of fields to show correlation. So we'll search for the user table and choose the sysuser table. And a common practice, or a best practice if you will, is that if you are integrating data from one system to another, that if some of the tables, especially tables that are built off of the task table, will have two fields. The first field called a correlation ID field, which stores the third-party unique identifier for that record, as well as a correlation display field, which is just a free-form text field that identifies the source from where that record came. The user table in this case does not have those two fields, so we're going to go ahead and add those. So we'll do correlation ID. And that will just be a string of 40 characters. Then we'll add correlation display. It'll also be a string of 40 characters. We'll update that. And we'll just verify that those were created. And they were. There they are right there. Okay, so now we've added those fields. Now we want to create a data source that will allow us to connect to the third-party database. So we'll go into our data sources list. And to stick with our, in order for this to automatically show up in our integration menu, let's just always start the data source name with Acme Research. And I'll say users here. And let's give it an import set table name. We'll just call it Acme Research Users. And in this case, we're going to be pulling from a database. So we're going to be leveraging the JDBC protocol. Now, while it is technically possible to make database calls directly from the instance to your database endpoint, it is a best practice to leverage a mid server for security, and also it offloads the work to the mid server. So if you have a long query, it's not tying up the instance at all. We're letting the mid server handle that. So I'm going to select a mid server that we have up, and the third-party database format is going to be in MySQL format. The database name is test in this case, and the port is 3306, and the user information is there, and I'll put in the server information. Now we can either bring in all rows from that table, or we could do a specific SQL statement. In this case, I'm just going to bring in all the users from the table. The name of the table is, I believe it's called Research Users. Research User. And a best practice is to use this last run date time if at all possible. This is a Delta query, and this will allow us to keep track of what was the last timestamp that we, what was the latest modification that we got on a database query. And we save that so in subsequent queries we automatically add a where clause that filters any records that were modified after a certain timestamp. This particular table does not have a timestamp field, so we can't leverage that. But if it did, it would be a best practice to do so. So we're going to go ahead and click Submit now that we've set up the connection. Let's test that connection really quickly. So we'll jump over here and let's do a test load of 20 records. And now we see that the mid server has completed that query and it brought in 8 records. We could look at the data, the raw data that it brought in. As we can see here, there's a schema for this database table. It looks like usernames are in a user token field. First name is a field called first, last name is a field called last. There's a unique identifier ID field, looks like, for that database that we can grab and leverage. And looks like some encrypted password information. We don't need the passwords in this case, we're not going to worry about it. And it looks like in this case the phone numbers are stored in the database kind of with some sort of encoding. BUS is for the business phone or the office phone, and cell is for a mobile phone. So we'll want to handle that as we bring in that data as well. So that's our loaded data. The next step for us is to create a transform map. Now that we know the third-party database schema, we can create a map that will map that schema over to our ServiceNow system user table. So we'll name this transform map. We'll name it Research User Transform. And we want this data to go into our user table, our sys_user table, this tool to help us do this mapping exercise. So on the left will be the schema from the database, and on the right is the schema from our system user table. So we'll scroll down and say we want the first name and we want the last name. We don't worry about the password, we're not interested in it. We We don't want phone at this point because we need to do some transformation around that, so we're going to skip phone as well. We do want the user token, and we want the UUID, and I believe that's it for now. Let's go ahead and match these up to user fields. Let's go to the first name field and the last name field, as well as the user ID field for user token. And let's set the UUID to our correlation ID field that we created on the user table. And we'll go ahead and save that. This now gives us the mapping between the third-party schema and the ServiceNow schema. Note, I do want to also set the correlation display field to contain information that this is coming from the Acme research system. Though I don't have a corresponding field that I'm mapping to, I can still create a field map for that. And what I'll do is on the target field, we're going to select correlation display. And instead of mapping it to a field on the database, since there really is no field that matches this, we're going to use a source script. Source scripts are scripts that can run during the mapping process of a single field. These field source scripts really should only be used if you're transforming something quick and easy on the one field. In this case, all we want to do is hard code a string to that field to indicate that this is part of the Acme system. To do that, anything at the end of the script that is stored in a special variable called answer is what will end up being stored in the target field. So in this case, since we're just doing some hard coding value setting, we're just going to say answer equals Acme. This will set the value of Acme in the correlation display field. There we go. Now we need to handle the telephone number. The telephone number could either go to the mobile phone or it could go to the office phone. There's not really a good way to do that inside of a field map because the target field, it might be either the business phone or the mobile phone target field. So we'll want to create a new transform script that will handle this. And we want to do this just before the third-party data is saved to the target table. There's two special variables available in transform scripts. There's source, and then there's target. So our first step is to split up the phone value based on the colon character. So to do that, we'll say, coming from the source, it is the uPhone field, and we're going to split on the colon character. Now we're going to say, okay, if that first part is BUS for business, then we're going to set the actual phone number on our business phone field. In ServiceNow, the business phone is just phone, so we'll say target.phone equals parts 1. This is the other side of that colon. Otherwise, we're going to take the target value for mobile phone and set it to the phone number. We'll go ahead and save that. All right, now we're transforming the data. We're setting a correlation display variable to a hard-coded Acme string. We're also bringing in the UUID and setting it on the correlation ID. The next thing we need to do is do a coalesce, meaning a coalesce is a type of primary key. Essentially, we're saying, all right, if data coming in this field or in a certain number of fields is the same as data that already exists on the table in those fields, we're going to update that record rather than create a new record. In this case, what we'll want to say is if the correlation ID already exists in the user table, we want to update that record with this incoming information rather than creating a new user that might have a duplicate correlation ID. If this follows true with that UUIDs are unique, then the correlation ID should always, in this case, be unique in our user table. So we're going to select that as our coalesce field. Now, one best practice that you need to be aware of is that if you're going to be potentially dealing with large tables or growing tables, it is always wise to create an index on the target table for the coalesce field. In this case, if there's a good chance that our user table is going to hold millions of records and that we're going to be bringing in a large number of records with this import, we would want to have ServiceNow customer support set up an index on this correlation ID field on the user table so that when the system tries to look for that particular value, it's looking against an index rather than making a full query on the table. All right, so now that we have this, we're going to save it. And let's jump back to our data source and let's perform the actual load. So we'll click Load All Records. Okay, that's successful. So now let's run the transform. And the transform is complete. So now if we jump to our user table, we could set up a filter on correlation display starts with Acme. And these are the 8 user records that were brought over from that database system. Let's check to see if our phone numbers came in okay. We got our first name and our last name, and the mobile phone field was filled out for Angela Maya. So it looks like our transform script is working nicely as well. Notice that this was a polling mechanism when we use data sources. David Gatley also mentioned that we have web services attached to our import set tables as well. Whenever you're doing bulk data transfer, it's best to use data sources and pull that data in. They're more tailored to a bulk import, and they offer better performance on the system. The web services are a great alternative if you hope to push data into ServiceNow in a transactional fashion, meaning one record at a time. So your best practice rule of thumb is if you're dealing with bulk data, go through these data sources to pull that data. If you're dealing with transactional data, try to set it up so the third party pushes that data in through the web service API for your import set table. Now the next thing we're going to do is to set up a scheduled import so that we don't have to do this manually all the time. To do that, we'll just go to Scheduled Imports and we will create a new schedule. We'll call this Research Acme Research Users. And if you were to do this on a daily or weekly basis, and this has a good possibility of being a large import, you would want to make sure that you would set it for a time that's going to be the least possible impact on your instance. And we'll choose our Acme Research Users data source. We'll go ahead and submit that. Now if you recall in our previous training video, we had created a menu system for our integration. We did not include a scheduled data import, however, module, and since we're leveraging that, we really should add that to our integration menu. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and edit the application, and we'll jump down here and we'll add a new module, and we'll call this Scheduled Imports. And we'll say this is a list of records. We're going to take this off of the Scheduled Data Import table. And we only want to show the ones where the name starts with Acme Research. And we'll go ahead and submit that. We'll also want to put an order for that. We'd probably want that to show up. Looks like data sources are 2230, so we could say we want scheduled imports to be 2231. That will refresh the navigation pane. So if we come here and type in Acme, we can see that just under data sources are scheduled imports. And if we click that, there's the scheduled import that we just created that tells the system when to import those users. There are a couple more things I'd like to highlight very quickly about transform maps and import sets along the lines of best practices. You might notice that a data source can have more than one transform map associated with it. Now, if at all possible, we recommend that you keep this keep this down to one transform map, although we do allow you to have more than one. On some rare occasions, it does make sense to do more than one transform map. Just be aware that if you do have multiple transform maps, let's say if you had 3 transform maps associated to one data source, every record that comes in through that data source is going to generate 3 records in the staging table, one for each transform map. So if you're ever tempted to have more than one map, you need to ask yourself if that's really necessary, or can you do this in a way that you can have just one transform map. Another thing I wanted to mention relates to the transform scripts themselves within the map. This particular transform script that we had in our example was pretty simple. It does a string split and sets values to a field based on the split results. The processing time and the hit to the system resources are very low with this. However, if we were to try to do lots of database calls using glide record or web service calls to a third party during that transform, the script will likely, that script is likely going to be executing with every record coming into the system, and that's going to slow down your import and consume resources. So if you were bringing in thousands of records through a database poll, your transform script would be executing 1,000 times. And if your script is inefficient or is interacting with other systems in a slow manner, that's going to slow down your import and consume valuable resources within the instance. So the end statement there in best practice is to keep these scripts as concise and efficient as possible so that they can handle large amounts of data coming through them.
All right, thanks, John. That's fantastic. I can see that the force is strong with you still. So the best practices that were showed today really focused on how you manage import sets coming into ServiceNow, specifically that we prefer import sets over direct web services, proper coalescing, JDBC imports should utilize a mid-server, keeping your transform scripts simple and concise, and avoiding multiple transform maps per import set. Additionally, indexing on a coalesce field for potentially large target tables reduces any potential for performance impacts. So thank you for watching video 2, the import set best practices. Be sure to check out the next video in the series, which is the inbound web services best practices, or video number 3 in the series.